Well, there's no doubt that Hitchcock's formation was in the silent period. He was 40 or close to 40 when he went to America, and he'd already made more than 20 films. And the fascinating thing about Hitchcock, in the perspective of history, I think, is that he channels so many of the possibilities of cinema in the early years, in the silent period. He had no particular loyalty to British cinema, although his roots in British cinema have been underestimated. They're quite important. He's described by the American scholar Jane Sloan as being a sponge, and I think that's a very good metaphor. More than any director, Hitchcock was a sponge because he didn't have a life before he went into films. He was set on going into films from a young age, and he sort of gave himself an education in cinema by picking up things from Hollywood cinema, of course, and German cinema, where he made his first 2 films. And then after he'd started tentatively to make his own films, the impact of the Soviet directors and theorists kicked in. And all the time he'd been working with some very skillful people from British cinema, notably his first screenwriter, Eliot Stannard, who formulated a lot of the things we think of as typical Hitchcock ideas before Hitchcock had begun to make films at all. He also married somebody who was more experienced than he was and clearly had a lot of skill and insight, namely Alma Reville. Hitchcock was fascinated with the, as he once put it, the nouns, verbs and adjectives of the film language. And he formulated that in the silent period when he was making, I think he was making a film called The Farmer's Wife. And he just liked the pleasure and the power of putting together visual images into a narrative and absorbing an audience and making a meaning which was not inherent in the individual images. And he always liked to cite the early Russian theorists, Kuleshov and Pudovkin, for the mechanics of putting together images, 1 + 1 = 3, that kind of thing. But he was there already in his very early films, before he'd seen Russian films or read Russian theories. He was just fascinated with what I think you can also see as the mathematics of editing, the mathematics of the visual language, where mathematics and science meet the arts. So in the silent films, you can see Hitchcock taking on board currents of possibilities, technical and structural and aesthetic, from all over the place, and forging them into a very distinctive kind of cinematic narrative.